Nik Zeps from St John of God Healthcare, which is the organisation I work for the most part, although I do work for the Departments of Health of West Australia and also for the Federal Department of Health through sitting on their principal committees. But as I stressed in my presentation today, I'm not giving the views of any of those organisations, but it's a personal view in many respects, but drawing upon, obviously, my experiences in working in those sectors.
So tell me, what was the focus of your presentation today?
The talks in general were giving about who ACTA is and about the state of clinical trials in Australia. So ACTA being the Australian Clinical Trials Alliance. And so my colleague gave the initial overview of what clinical trials networks are in Australia and the importance of that. So I thought it was important that we talk about sustainability. And sustainability is an important topic because money is the most pressing issue for most clinical trials, and making sure that there's enough to go around, that there's the financial support, but it goes beyond that, because the other areas of necessity for running clinical trials are really those that are the kind of in-kind or infrastructure support in institutions. And whilst we understand that clinical trials are terribly important and that they deliver improvements to patient well-being, it's been extremely difficult to get the funding for those organisations. And so I thought I would give a little bit of a background as to where the funding was, where some of the issues lay, and to also illustrate that unless we do clinical trials, we really are not giving our patients the best medicines.
One of the issues that's come up already this morning is the divide between sponsor and academic research. Mm-hmm. What are the things that we might do to bring those two fields together?
The divide is slightly artificial. Most of the cooperative trials groups that involve new medications will have an enduring existing relationship with the pharmaceutical industry, because a lot of the drugs or devices that are being used in those studies are supplied by what are essentially commercial companies. The not-for-profit sector also does the kinds of research which isn't aimed at registration but new uses, potentially improved access to some of those products, and that in itself means that there may be instances in which there is competition for recruitment of specific patient groups. So some of those patients may have the same characteristics, the same criteria that you want in both a commercial and a non-commercial trial. Well, the question then has to be, who gets priority? And healthcare systems have been increasingly focused on making sure that they can provide income for their activities and that there is full cost recovery. And unfortunately that means then that they will go to the highest bidder. Now, you could argue if it was a very good drug, a very important new breakthrough, well then absolutely we should do the study that involves the industry sponsored study, which is then going to lead to registration of a new pharmaceutical or device, which is then going to bring that treatment to patients. So it's a debate that isn't really being had out in the open, but it's one that certainly is lively and behind the doors. So one of the things that I touched upon in my presentation as well today was that in fact there need be no competition, that there needs to be a more strategic approach to how we do clinical research so that both of those activities can be supported in Australia and that we can have the most effective trials that are done. And one of the things there is that the infrastructure used by both of the sectors is essentially the same. So they use the same staff members who are employed in the hospitals, they use the same offices, they use the same laboratories. All of those things are common within the organisations. And running industry trials is often the means by which the not-for-profit sector can actually do their trials at all, because it would be simply unsustainable to pay the salaries of these kinds of staff were you not to have those. So it's an area that I think will be improved by the formation of ACTA, because ACTA then becomes a body that can have a more clear conversation with similar representative industry groups so that there's a greater mutual understanding between the two groups. And again, we brought that out in discussion towards the end of the presentation. A series of questions arose during the question time about the role of ACTA. We're a relatively new organisation. We don't have a website yet. In fact, we don't have an executive officer. And although we're recruiting actively at this moment, nevertheless, the interim executive committee is comprised of the major clinical trials networks in this country, in the not-for-profit sector. And one thing that Ros Haslam and I both wanted to be able to present to the audience today of the ARCS delegates was that ACTA now exists, that it's an organisation that they can work with and partner with, that has a common goal towards encouraging clinical trials in Australia. But importantly, it's a single voice that can go to government, rather than each clinical trials group knocks on the door of the relevant ministers or goes to the various departmental secretaries and says, well, this is what our interests are. We can go with one common voice. And in fact, we can then do that with industry colleagues and be able to do that together. So again, it's really to present a common front of our belief that the way to deliver most effective medicine is through clinical trials and through clinical research as a whole. And really to fulfil many of the comments that were made or recommendations made in the McKeon review, which state that we should be doing more clinical research and it should be embedded in healthcare practice. Well, we see ourselves together with ARCS and industry as being part of a triumvirate that can deliver that in Australia.
And is that the key takeout you wanted ARCS members to take away, or was there another point that you really wanted? If there was one thing that they took away from the session today, what was that?
Well, we certainly wanted to raise the profile of ACTA and its potential role, but from a very personal point of view, I've become committed to the idea that we're all potentially agents of change and that we can talk about what we'd like to see change in a system, but we ourselves actually have to do that work. And so one of the key messages that I wanted to get across was that any organisation like ARCS, ACTA, any of those pharmaceutical industry working groups were only ever going to deliver what individual members actually contributed, and that in fact the power was within any of the delegates to read the documentation, to formulate their views, to engage with their colleagues, to engage in their workplaces, and to really become empowered through knowing that there were their colleagues in these organisations that would support them. So really that was the message, was to make sure that people felt that they didn't just have to sit there as a passive person who takes on the comments of others, but they could participate. And I hope that several people will take up that challenge to do that. I would make one particularly important comment that was raised in the question time was about the way that we're perceived publicly. And in part that is also how well we engage with the people that we do this work for, who are the community of people who suffer from diseases in this country. And that's certainly an area we can do a lot better with. We can engage much more with so-called health consumers, with the various patient advocacy groups, because they're really our best friends when it comes to advocating the common cause that we want, which is better healthcare, better community well-being. So as an organisation, if ARCS exists to deliver effectively better health and better well-being, then it's going to have to engage a great deal more with the community. And I think that that's certainly a challenge that a number of people in the room felt was really important. And I'm walking away from that question time reminded that I can still do better, even in our own practice, to be able to engage with the community.